I do feel the need to give a special thank you to Linda Vavra, who has done such a fantastic job moving us into this online format. So yes, everyone is giving her the round of applause that she so justly deserves. She's fearlessly brought our Institute events online, and so I'm grateful for that. I do want to just make a couple of announcements here. On September 10th, Stephen Engelman will be presenting his talk, What Went Wrong with Economics, at 4 p.m. on Zoom. Andy Clarno will be giving his fellows lecture on October 20th. Because of the pandemic, we delayed some talks from the spring, and we're now having them in the fall, both Hayley's talk and Steve's talk, and thanks to all of the fellows for their flexibility in this. They really helped us all through this very difficult time that we're still in. Backing up just a bit on our calendar, on September 30th, we'll be hosting a Zoom session with Mary Macklem from the NEH at 11 a.m. And she will run a workshop on fellowship applications with me. I'll be talking about Institute fellowships. And really every year we're inviting a different external officer from a grant and fellowship granting foundation to speak about application procedures. And so even if you're not planning on applying for an NEH next year or anytime soon, you may want to someday. So definitely participate in that discussion. I highly recommend it. Next year, we'll probably invite someone from a research library and on down the line. On October 6th at 10 a.m., we'll have Neil Lester, who is a speaker he's the Mellon Engaged Humanities lecturer. And you can get in touch with Ellen McClure about attending that lecture. And if you have a student, or if you are an undergraduate student and you would like to learn about the Engaged Humanities Initiative, we have faculty right here on Zoom who have so generously been teaching in that initiative. And it's really fantastic. If you'd like to learn more about it, do speak to Ellen McClure. Just a couple more things. On October 22nd and 23rd, our Digital Humanities Initiative, which is a collaboration between the Institute and the UIC Library, will be hosting a conference on resources and visibility in engaged humanities. You can find out about all of these events on our Institute website. And on October 29th and 30th, the Institute will be collaborating with Special Collections at the UIC Library for a conference on different archives, different histories. It's a conference on the past and present politics of archives. And that is going to be a very exciting conference too, and I hope you'll join us for all of these events. So I also, in addition to thanking Linda Vavra, I also wanted to give one more shout out to Professor Laura Hostetler. She was the interim director of the Institute for the Humanities in the spring, and it is certainly not the kind of interim directorship that she had been dreaming of, not that she was like dreaming of the directorship ever, but it was still something that was a very difficult task, and she led the Institute during a really difficult time, and so I'm incredibly grateful for that, and she continues to be such a wonderful interlocutor about Institute business. So now on to today's talk. I'm so excited to be starting our talks for the year and to be introducing Hayley Negrin to speak today. Hayley is an assistant professor in the Department of History, where she's been on the faculty since 2018. She received her BA from Barnard and her PhD from NYU. Her work is on the history of the enslavement of Native American women and children from the American South. Negrin's groundbreaking project explores this important chapter in American history that expands the record on the history of slavery beyond the transatlantic slave trade, showing how slavery, in this case, was consistent in a violent appropriation of labor from Native populations. And her study also sharpens the picture of colonial domination of Native groups and territories. Negrin explores how enslavement and control of Native populations of women and children in particular was part of a focused strategy of disempowerment through the destruction of kinship bonds. She further argues that the past imprints the present, as colonial violence echoes in the continued attacks on Native American sovereignty in our own day. She has published a book chapter from her work called, a collection called Native Women Work the Ground, Civility and Enslavement in the Early American South, or that's the name of her essay, sorry. It is in a collection called Atlantic Environments in the American South. And she's been presenting her work at numerous conferences and invited talks throughout the US. She's also received numerous awards for her work, including grants and fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the American Academy of, and the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at Penn. In addition to working on issues pertaining to the history of Native Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries, she's spoken about the relation between Native Americans and environmental rights and acted particularly in connection with the Dakota Access Pipeline. Just last year, in fact, during Happier and Better Times, Hayley was a contributor to the fantastic workshop on indigeneity and climate change at the Institute, and I hope that we can all find ways of continuing that discussion in the future. Without further ado, I would like to thank Hayley for delaying her talk until now and for that flexibility. And please join me in welcoming her to speak on fugitive lands, Indigenous slavery and gender in the early American South. Thank you, Hayley.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to Linda at the Institute, and also, of course, Laura, and my fellow fellows. I loved learning with you all last year. And thank you to my department for supporting my leave. It was a full year, and supporting my personal and professional work more generally. UIC has been a really good place to be an early career researcher. I'm struggling a little bit with the Zoom format. If anybody was at my job talk, you know I like to walk around and gesticulate wildly and do some energetic pacing. Maybe it's the New Yorker in me. So if everyone just bear with me. Not seeing people in person is a little bizarre, but of course the trade-off is that I get to have friends and colleagues in my field from across the country here with me today. Thank you for taking your time out of the first few weeks of teaching to be here with me and to help me with my book. I'm sending you a virtual hug. So I'd like to start today by acknowledging both the Indigenous land we're on and saying a few brief words about the First Nations garden here in Chicago and Albany Park. So the University of Illinois at Chicago and Hayley Negrin on Zoom are both situated on the Indigenous homelands of the Council of the Free Fighters, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, and the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria, Kaskaskia nations. Many other nations, including the Miami, the Wea, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, Thakawaki, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, and Muscoutin peoples also call this region home. And Chicago is also home to one of the most largest and diverse urban Native communities in the country. You know, LA and New York are in competition. So we're going to be discussing ecological colonialism a little bit today and the importance of traditional medicines to Indigenous people in the southern part of North America. So I think it would be remiss of me not to point out that there is an ongoing struggle in our backyard over the preservation of Native land and non-human plant relations in Chicago right now. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the First Nations Garden was launched jointly by the Chi Nations Youth Council, an urban Native youth advocacy group, and the American Indian Center here in Chicago, which has been a gathering place for urban Natives for over half a century now since urban relocation. The garden is a key part of the land reclamation movement among Indigenous people here in Chicago. And I think many community members might argue it's the heart of it. Restoring traditional plant medicines such as tobacco, which you can actually see here planted in the middle of the circle of sunflowers in front of the teepee to community members, has been key to healing and the urban native struggle for sovereignty here in the city. While a lot of us have seen the very public debates about taking down Columbus statues, which are crucial, very important, depending on who you ask, protecting the garden may even be more vital. There is an alderman attempting to scout the area for a shopping mall, is my understanding right now. And the city has been slow because of COVID to formally transfer the lease of the land to community members, which has inhibited running water in the garden, which anybody who's involved in a community garden, running water is very key. So the plants need to get, so the plants can get what they need. This project could use your engagement and support, and part of the point is of the garden is to be a space for public education about Native people to increase awareness. So there are opportunities at USD to bring your students there and help them understand the importance of Indigenous plants to sovereignty and Indigenous Chicago more generally. Though it's a Native space, right? It's also a public space for education. If anybody, I will be posting these donation links on Twitter and Facebook after I have a glass of wine after this presentation. All right, so let's move to an earlier moment in time and to the American South by looking at a runaway slave ad that I've titled Born of an Indian Woman. In the winter of 1748, an enslaved man named Samson and an enslaved boy named Sam ran away from their master, a New Jersey tavern owner named Silas. Wanting to get his property back, Silas responded by placing a runaway slave ad, detailing everything he knew about the man and boy. On the face of it, this runaway slave ad fulfills our expectations about what slavery and fugitivity look like in early America. Like most masters placing runaway slave ads in the period, Silas focused on the details that mattered most to him, which meant including information that he felt would most likely lead to the recovery of his property. Physical characteristics of the runaways that onlookers might use to spot them were important, as were methods they might use to conceal themselves. But the ad diverges from the norm in important ways. For instance, the first thing Silas felt he needed to mention as he explained how to find the boy and man was that Samson had, quote, some Indian blood in him, end quote, and that Sam, quote, was born of an Indian woman, end quote. Silas warned that they might physically look Native, and they were probably wearing Native dress. They definitely, quote, spoke Indian very well, end quote. They also carried a gun and a rug with them. In other words, these were Afro-Native people, and the terms of their fugitivity had Indigenous origins. Silas felt confident that they were headed to the Southeast, so much so that he placed an ad in a Charlestown paper all the way from New Jersey. The gun and the rug are two items that would have been helpful for entering the Southeastern economy. Their knowledge of a Southeastern Native language, as Silas mentioned, which one we don't know, was also key. New Jersey was a recipient of an intercolonial coastal trade in Southeastern Native slaves that began in Carolina but extended into Virginia and North Carolina. Roughly 50,000 Southeastern Native people were enslaved from 1670 to 1717, and the majority of these people were Native women and children. Traded by their enemies to the English and captured on English raids on their communities. Women and children were the population that lived on in the plantation complex after male kin were often killed in battle. As they entered the Atlantic economy and became the property of white masters, enslaved natives became known as Indian. Women passed on racial slavery to children who became known again as Indian or mulatto or mustee, or in some cases even Negro. We can see the deployment of these racial categories, these very diverse racial categories, through wills, bills of sale, mortgages, slave codes, and the colonial archive of slavery in the early South. Plantation slavery subverted these Indigenous women's roles as both cultural and political reproducers in their society. In the Southeastern groups like the Choctaw, Cherokee, Catawba, Appalachee that enslaved Indigenous women came from, women were responsible for passing down critical knowledge to their children about agriculture, clan, and religion. Their establishment and maintenance of family ties knit matrilineal communities together and provided children with a sense of geographic space too, since women were primary caregivers who took their children to work with them in the maize fields. Following what we know about the trade and Silas's description, Sam's mother likely came from one of these groups. And it was her native knowledge that she had passed on to Sam that bound Sam and Samson together in a critical moment in their lives and allowed them to imagine a different kind of life for themselves on fugitive ground. As they mapped it out prior to their escape, their life would proceed on sovereign Indigenous territory in the Southeast where they planned to go. This shows another truth about slavery in this moment. Indigenous sovereignty provided an existential and physical threat to the plantation system. As long as there were alternative spaces for Indigenous governing bodies across the South, there were opportunities for the enslaved to cast off bondage. But the threat of sovereignty was also a daily problem for enslavers seeking to control their Indigenous property, as this ad shows. As long as Indigenous slaves kept knowledge related to the environment and their human and non-human kin alive through oral histories and their ongoing relationships to place, Indigenous sovereignty remained alive within the plantation complex. And as long as Indigenous sovereignty remained alive, it was possible to build fugitive spaces for survival, even within the violent world of Southern slavery. The process of deterritorializing Native peoples, and Native women in particular, and expressions of Indigenous sovereignty have long been a subject of study for scholars of Indigenous feminisms and Native American and Indigenous studies more broadly. For these scholars, settler colonialism is a gendered process that fractures Indigenous sovereignty in all its different iterations. As Rachel Flowers writes, settler colonialism is invested in gaining certainty to lands and resources and will achieve access to the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, violently or legislatively, a process that begins with the body, specifically the bodies of Indigenous women. Leanne Simpson reminds us that Indigenous governance is grounded in intimate forms of self-determination within the body, in what she calls body sovereignty. Settler states exercise authority not only by targeting lands, but Indigenous bodies, which embody Indigenous sovereignty. As she writes, "My body's sovereignty is not subject to attack just because it is an Indigenous woman's body. My body's sovereignty is subject to attack because it exists as a Anishinaabe political order that threatens forms of sovereignty to settler states." Racialization has been yet another useful tool in deterritorializing Native people from their nations. As Joanne Barker has explained in relation to current federal Indian policy, settler regimes routinely impose racial identities on Native people in order to, quote, keep the threats posed by Native governance and territorial rights at bay. In other words, you become the member of a racial group instead of a sovereign citizen of a sovereign Indigenous nation. Putting the work of Indigenous feminists in more direct conversation with historical work on the development of slavery and race in the US is a key focus of my book, Fugitive Lands, Indigenous Slavery and Gender in the Early American South. Based on research in hundreds of Virginia and South Carolina wills and inventories, discussions with Indigenous intellectuals invested in the histories of their nations, and environmental research, the work spans roughly between 1670 to 1717, during the height of the Indigenous slave trade across the South. This is a history largely about women in the breach. The historiographic breach between the fields of Indigenous history and Atlantic slavery, and the archival breach between the reproduction of colonial power and stories of fugitivity and survival. Enslaved Indigenous women defy categorization in ways that make it hard for us to know them. As with the histories of so many enslaved Indigenous women in the South, Sam's mother is both everywhere and nowhere in this story. She is crucial to explaining the how and why of Sam and Samson's flight, but we don't know her name, her polity, or the specific details of her capture. She is the engine behind it all, the knowledge, the matrilineal family line, the polity, the fugitivity, but she comes to us in an archival fragment produced to profit from the distortion of all of these things. This makes it difficult as historians to help us place her and Sam and Samson back into their specific territories and kinship lines. So how are we to write this history? Perhaps no one has articulated the difficulty of working with the colonial archive of slavery to write about enslaved women better than Black feminist scholars. As Saidiya Hartman wrote in Venus in Two Acts, as she attempted to exhume one Black woman named Venus, killed aboard a slave ship from the destructive archival trail of the Middle Passage. The archive is, in this sense, a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, an asterisk in the grand narrative of history. As Marisa Fuentes has argued most recently in her study of enslaved women in 18th century Barbados, the violence of the colonial archive can inhibit historical accounts of enslaved women and potentially lead historians to create historical narratives that reproduce violent colonial discourses. Here is another example of the archival materials I work with to write the history of enslaved Indigenous women in the South. This is the 1703 inventory of the estate of William Chambers, a planter from Henrico County, Virginia. If you can see, right above the English bed and pillow and rug, valued at 1,000 pounds of tobacco, there is an Indian girl slave, valued at 3,000 pounds of tobacco. This is what we know about her, her economic value, and the fact that she was owned by a colonial man. We don't have any meaningful information about this woman besides the story of her commodification. And why would we? The producers of the document wouldn't benefit from that. They benefit from her alienation, from her lands and her kin, so that's what we see here. But I think this document not only shows us what by now should be a familiar story to scholars of slavery and gender, that women were enslaved and this bolstered the authority of colonial men, that archival materials can reproduce racialized and gendered violence, but that racial slavery was also an agent of ecological colonialism that impacted Indigenous people in specific ways. As I argue in Fugitive Lands, enslaved Indigenous women not only became part of the development of racial patriarchy in the South, they became coerced actors in the environmental changes that transformed Virginia and South Carolina landscapes from indigenous lands, where the Three Sisters grew, to plantation lands, where tobacco and rice monocrop production predominated. And as they were forced to remake indigenous lands for plantation development and monocrop production, enslaved women like this experienced a profound reordering of their relationships to their plant relations. Virginians lacked specie in this period, so this enslaved Indigenous woman was actually valued in tobacco, a medicine and a spiritually crucial type of plant relation for Native Southeasterners then and now. She was commodified in what had been sacred, just as Indigenous land across the South was rapidly being commodified for rice and tobacco staple crops. Her struggle as an enslaved Native woman, therefore, overlaps with the struggles of Southeasterners trying to maintain not only their freedom, but their ecological relationships at a moment when plantation expansion threatened both. For Hartman, the way to move towards redressing the violence of the archive is to describe the conditions of Venus that determine her appearance and dictate her silence. I argue that considering Indigenous women's relationships to their non-human plant relations, their lands, and ultimately their body sovereignty is how we need to read the archive of Indigenous slavery if we are to avoid reproducing the violence of the archive. If we think of tobacco not just as a staple crop, but as a relation, we can understand the conditions of this Native woman's commodification, why she appears to us in this way. And in a much more blunt historical sense, we can understand more about how she was incorporated into the plantation complex and what that experience was like as an Indigenous woman. And this emphasis on sovereignty, both body sovereignty and sovereignty as a political order outside the body, can also help us understand how Native slavery unfolded in the early South as a deeply contested institution, both on and off the plantation. Finally, it helps us consider the American South not as a space that was destined for plantation development, but as an Indigenous space, or as a fugitive land. So why has it been so hard to know enslaved Indigenous women historically? Scholars who focus on race in the plantation complex in the American South have often struggled to reconcile colonial interests in enslaving Native people with the rise of African slavery and anti-Black racism in the South. In what Virginia scholars would come to refer to famously as the origins debate, historians sought to understand the root of what they felt was perhaps the greatest American evil, African slavery and racism. What came first, race or slavery? Was African slavery an unthinking decision, like Winthrop Jordan famously argued? Or did colonists adopt African racial slavery and anti-Black racism to solidify relations between upper and lower class whites after Bacon's Rebellion, as the story goes in Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom? Regardless of where scholars fell on the question, historians struggle to explain the hows and whys of Native enslavement and the institution's relationship to race. If colonists were so dedicated to African slavery and racism against Black people, then why did colonists also enslave thousands of Native people in the South? The Indian slave trade stopped at some point for some reason, as the increasing numbers of African slaves showed. Perhaps Native slavery was a stepping stone to the real slavery in the South. And some of this discomfort has been picked up by more recent historians. Native slavery was, quote, never significant to the plantation complex, end quote, as Philip Morgan has recently argued. The hundreds of enslaved Native children who populated Virginia counties after Bacon's Rebellion amounted to, quote, one shipment of African slaves, end quote, as John Coombs wrote in his 2011 article on the adoption of African slavery in Virginia. They might have alleviated labor shortages in southwestern counties, he argues. Native women made up a significant population of Native slaves in early South Carolina, but were soon, quote, swallowed in the tide by new African arrivals, as Ira Berlin argued in Many Thousands Gone. Native slaves are untraceable in Southern history. In reality, Indigenous Southeasterners had to launch a protracted effort to remain outside of the plantation complex and processes of racial commodification, and thousands did not succeed. From the beginning of aggressive slaving in Virginia and Carolina in the 1670s up until the end of the Yamasee War in 1717, when Yamasees and their allies joined together to end their involvement with Carolina traders because of attacks on women in their communities, the trade became about defending female kin and gender relations. While enslaved Africans came off the Middle Passage already deterritorialized from their home polities, already saltwater slaves, as Stephanie Smallwood would say, settlers in the early South had to work out the legal and cultural mechanisms around dispossessing and racializing powerful Native neighbors who held sway in the geopolitical fate of the region. They were not always successful, both because of the tactics of Southeastern nations and because of the legal snarls involved in enslaving members of sovereign nations who they recognized as trading and diplomatic partners. But it was not for lack of trying or lack of interest, or because settlers did not racialize Native people. It was because of Indigenous sovereignty, both European perceptions of it in an early modern sense, and Indigenous enactments of it, that Native slavery came to be limited at all in the early South. Over the span of years, the institution was a less numerically significant institution of slavery than African slavery, but a deeply significant institution nevertheless that shaped the lives of the enslaved and the Indigenous and colonial geopolitics of the region. While the scholars mentioned above were all trying to take on the gargantuan task of explaining nothing more or less than the adoption of racial slavery in America and could not tackle everything in their projects, we still need to be sensitive about the potential for erasing Native people in scholarship. Settler colonialism is not only a physical process of elimination, it's about representation as well. What fictions about Native people and American history more generally do we recreate when we say Native slavery was never significant? Despite the importance of Native slavery and sovereignty to the history of the South, there is a seductive fiction about Native slavery that settlers created much later in history after Native groups refused to be involved in the trade in order to protect themselves. This is the idea that Natives were never enslaved in great numbers and settlers never considered them suitable for enslavement at all. This still lingers in Southern historiography a little bit, and it accounts for some of the ways that scholars of the plantation complex sometimes skip over this important chapter in the history of racial slavery in the South. So let's briefly look at an 1840s freedom suit from Charleston, South Carolina to help us understand this ideology of erasure. In the case, State v. Belmont, a judge ordered a young Afro-Native woman freed because natives, quote, never made valuable slaves, but withered away in a state alien to the red man's nature. It was unethical, the judge argued, to, quote, hold in category of slave the spare remnants of the red man who had largely lived in amity with us. Meanwhile, as he wrote, all history assures us that the Negro race thrive in health, multiply greatly, become civilized and religious, and are happy when in subjection to the white race. This was actually picked up a little bit by early historians. As Winthrop Jordan argued in White Over Black in the 60s, Native slavery never became significant to colonists because, quote, Americans came to impute to the braves of the Indian nations an ungovernable individuality. With the Negro, it was utterly different. As Almond Lauber wrote in one of the first dissertation-length research pieces written on Native slavery, natives were, quote, too inferior in capacity to make proper slaves. And this has to do with disease narratives of that. At the same time, though, that they were inferior in a bodily sense for the hard work of slavery, they were also too wild to be subdued. As Lauber explained, few wild tribes of the continent were capable of subjection to domestic slavery. Indians simply ran away too often. These deeply paradoxical ideas set into motion perhaps as early as Thomas Jefferson, whose great-grandfather had been a native slave owner and who had also waxed poetically on native unsuitability for enslavement, served to racialize native sovereignty by constructing an image of indigenous people as wild, free, as bad slaves. Settlers did this in a later time period when the early republic was deep into Indian removal and African slavery was expanding in order to point to whose destiny it was in the time period meant for racial slavery, which was African people, and whose destiny it was to disappear so lands could be taken and made available, which was Native people. But at the same time that the Charleston judge tried to enforce these racial categories, stating that African people were meant for slavery, indigenous people were meant to disappear, and didn't possess proper sovereignty, he also pointed to the fact that Native people had been, quote, in amity with South Carolina, meaning their polities were not at war, and therefore natives could not be legally enslaved. This law of nations logic for enslavement implied a recognition of native nationhood. In this awkward way, the judge applied a racialized logic to natives through the lens of a troubling kind of freedom. Troubling, no doubt, because of the persistence of native people to be recognized by Euro-American governing structures. Settlers both in the colonial period and later were deeply uncomfortable with native sovereignty. In the early American mind, whiteness was equated with sovereignty, or as Americans often refer to it, freedom, liberty, nationhood, etc. And natives were racialized as Indian and therefore non-white, therefore theoretically non-sovereign, wild, individual, bad slaves. During the era of the native slave trade, colonists actively racialized native people, but were also forced to recognize the sovereignty of native nations to an extent because they depended on native polities to supply them with slaves. It was difficult to square racialized visions of native people, which developed because of the ideology of white supremacy and enslavement, with the very real reality of their sovereignty, which had to be reckoned with, but by white supremacist logic should not exist. In reality, neither colonists nor natives necessarily knew what kind of slavery would take hold within the plantation complex in the South. In different southern regions, native slavery predominated over African slavery. In South Carolina, around the turn of the century, native people accounted for around 25% of the entire enslaved population. Slave raiders like Nathaniel Bacon in Virginia and James Moore in South Carolina had profound influence on colonial policy. James Moore captured thousands of Appalachian women and children on raids, and he became governor of South Carolina. While most of us know how Nathaniel Bacon's swing at the governorship in Virginia turned out, he died during the rebellion. The rebellion was very much about acquiring native slaves, especially for lower class planters who could not afford labor outside the household. And after the rebellion, as this pie chart shows, native slaves predominated in households across the southwestern portion of the colony. Supplies of African slaves were not necessarily assured in Virginia in the 17th century, and elites were the ones with access to the Atlantic slave trade, and therefore African slaves for most of the period. Would native people be able to resist incorporation into the plantation complex? Would enslaved natives be the slavery of the lower classes? How far would racialization and enslavement go when it came to native people? These were open questions. For the English, recognizing the sovereignty of indigenous polities was a complex, uncomfortable process that could both support racialization processes and threaten them at the same time. Early modern English people who settled the South often saw all non-Christian populations together in the context of early modern international law. Classified together as everything from barbarians to heathens to infidels, in this view, Africans and natives were indigenous people whose rights were tethered to an impressive and diverse canon of legal thought that provided both the legal and cultural structure around enslavement and racialization. These laws also tied the question of sovereignty together with the question of slavery. As Herman Bennett has shown in African Kings and Black Slaves, Sovereignty and Dispossession in the Early Modern Atlantic, in the early years of the African slave trade, European traders distinguished between different polities in Africa on the basis of the sovereign and the sovereignless, as he calls them. While Europeans looked on everyone as heathen, or all non-Christians, not everyone was racialized or as aggressively or categorized as a racial slave. There were Black kings, too, who wielded a form of sovereignty that was recognizable under European law. Building off Bennett's work, I see this brutal process of categorization unfolding in the Southeast during the early era of the native slave trade. There were slaving partners from polities deemed sovereign, and then there were slaves from polities deemed barbaric and racialized beyond the pale. Europeans were actively making decisions about who belonged in what category as they encountered new peoples. So in both slave trades and both continents, we need to be thinking about race and sovereignty in an intertwined way, because both ideas were shaping who ended up enslaved, who was recognized as a legitimate polity, and who was racialized as a slave. And this also brings us, of course, to the important ways that territory became intertwined with the question of native slavery in the South. In the Indigenous Southeast, polities that were deemed lacking sovereignty were not only more likely to see their women and children enslaved, they were more likely to lose their lands. For polities in the Southeast whose territories were physically butting up against the expanding plantation complex, like Powhatans, Yamassees, and others, legal and cultural representations of sovereignty became an important defensive strategy, alongside more obvious military tactics. The question became how to express their rights to territory and land in a way that was legally and culturally legible to the English. Powhatans, and specifically Pamunkeys, survived harrowing slave raids in the 1670s during Bacon's Rebellion and chose to embrace tributary sovereignty to the English crown in the aftermath. Their female queen, or Werenskwa, Kokokoeski, negotiated for an anti-native slavery treaty that linked her sovereignty to the king's sovereignty in order to protect not only women and children in her community, but her territory. Now, this was a treaty that the English continued to largely honor, and while enslaved children from the Carolina Piedmont were trafficked into Virginia after the rebellion, and numbers really blew up, Powhatans remained free from slavery. They held on to their lands in Pamunkey, which they still maintain today. They actually used this anti-native slavery treaty from 1676 to prove the existence of a 400-year-old nation-to-nation relationship with English settlers to receive federal recognition in 2015. All Virginia tribal nations actually reference this treaty in their recognition applications. So we can see in the long term how these early histories of the native slave trade shaped sovereignty as a legal order then and also now. So the English did recognize the sovereignty of people like the Pamunkeys eventually, and their trading partners in the slave trade like the Westos, Chickasaws, Yamassees, and others. But native sovereignty was also a deeply unstable category because, again, the English were uncomfortable with it. They were also racializing native people at the same time. So for Indigenous groups, making a wrong move could lead to wholesale territorial loss and enslavement. James Moore launched a slaving raid on the Westos in 1679 until, as one frustrated imperial official wrote, there was not yet 50 Westo left alive. The Westos had once been an important trading partner to both Virginia and South Carolina, supplying them with Indigenous slaves, supplying them with their enemies. But as soon as Moore recognized a better Indigenous partner who could supply him with more slaves, in this case the Shawnee, he took the Westos from their territory and tried to destroy them by transforming them into Indians and putting them into the Atlantic economy as slaves. One French administrator explained the situation well as he attempted to get the Chickasaw to turn away from their English alliance. The ultimate plan of the Englishmen, after weakening you by means of wars, is to come and seize you in your villages and then send you to be sold somewhere else. Faraway countries from which you can never return, as the English have treated others, you know. Because anybody could become Indian in this world, even the powerful Westos or the numerous and powerful Chickasaws, it was never clear how long a diplomatic relationship would last. Who would move from being a recognized ally to a racial slave? In this context, representing native sovereignty in a way the English understood and surviving on one's territory under the shadow of plantation expansion was a form of fugitivity. Some groups actually felt they had to leave the South in order to protect Native women and children from the trade. The Shawnee eventually left their alliance with South Carolina because they recognized the conditional nature of recognition and went north, while Appalachians also escaped South Carolina and went to French Louisiana. One of the reasons the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee came together again was because of this. In 1710, female Tuscarora elders were so concerned about the threat of slave raids and violence that they asked that their chiefs go north to visit with their Haudenosaunee brethren and the colonial government of Pennsylvania to receive permission to move there. They explained that they did not feel safe outside of their fields, and neither did their children. And they wanted to see if they might be welcome to return to their ancestors up north. As the provincial council in PA wrote, "They signified to us by a belt of wampum, which was sent from their old women, that those implored their friendship of the Christians and Indians of this government, that without danger or trouble they might fetch food and water. They also sent a belt from their children born and those yet in the womb, requesting that room to sport and play without danger of slavery might be allowed them." This is a meaningful quote, I think, because it shows the physicality of the moment. The physical fear that Native women felt because of slave raids when one never knew when an attack would come. The role Native women played in their governments, their relationship to children as those safeguarding the next generation. They even mention their wombs here, which I think becomes particularly important when we consider that enslaved Native women were exploited under the English doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, that which follows the womb, as African women were. Tuscarora women knew what was at stake in this moment. They lived right beside expanding plantations and would have seen enslaved Africans in the Carolinas. They understood what racial slavery was, how important reproductive labor was to that system, and how it threatened them in that moment, but also their children yet born. Native women actually became a litmus test for judging the civility of Native groups, and therefore their potential for possessing sovereignty. The challenge for Native Southeasterners who remained in the South when it came to presenting a different perception was that as the English were assessing their civility based on Native women and gender relations, they were engaging in a slave trade that sexualized and degraded Native women. So the enslavement of Native women ended up supporting the decay of Native sovereignty in English eyes. And the decay of sovereignty helped to further perpetuate attacks on Native nations and women. When the English stepped into the Indigenous Southeast and attempted to settle Virginia and Carolina, they encountered hundreds of different Indigenous polities with different gender relations. But one thing that was common across the Southeast, and Englishmen constantly remarked upon with concern, was the presence of both Indigenous women leaders and matrilineal kinship. This meant that chiefly leadership roles were passed down from mother to child, not from father to child. And sibling groups were key to social and political organization instead of nuclear patriarchal families. Matrilineal inheritance was so important to community organization that even in Southeastern Native polities that privileged male leadership, women who came from an elite matriline could inherit a chiefly role. In other words, their position in the matriline trumped their gender. But Englishmen assessed matrilineality as barbaric. As they entered the trading paths of the colonial Southeast in search of Indian slaves, European traders like John Lawson were often the first to contact and then write about the Indigenous nations and people they found. Jennifer Morgan has shown how travelers racialized the Black female body through early modern travel writing. And we see a similar process in the Southeast as traders imagined Native women during the era of the Native slave trade. It's easy to forget because her arguments are about Black women and they've become so crucial. But in Morgan's famous article, Some Could Suckle Over Their Shoulder, Male Travelers, Female Bodies, and the Gendering of Racial Ideology, Indigenous women were also an important part of her visual analysis. There was also a gendering of racial ideology going on in relation to Indigenous women. But there were differences that I aim to highlight in my work. As Lawson interacted with Siouan-speaking people in the Piedmont, he launched a racialized and gendered critique about the savages he saw that was rooted in matrilineality. As he wrote, Southeasterners ensured that, quote, the female issue carrying the heritage, for fear of impostors, the savages well knowing how much frailty possesses the Indian woman betwixt the garters and the girdle. In other words, Southeastern Native women were savages who were so sexually promiscuous with so many different men that they had to be the one to pass on family lines. Racial ideas about natives developed through this gendered discourse of European dominance like this. And this was put in practice on the ground through the enslavement of Southeastern Native women. Virginians and Carolinians built off this discourse as they wrote Indian into the slave codes across the South. They created this discourse about savage matrilineality, which enabled the physical attack on women's kinship lines through slave codes and partis. Partis said that all children should inherit the condition of the mother. And while it's written mostly to apply to African women, we also have to remember that the law was written generally, right? And we can see in slave codes in Virginia, like this one on the screen, that Native women were often treated in similar ways to African women. But this was only once their polities had been broken, their relationship to their polities had been broken, and they were deemed sovereignless. The sovereignty connection is huge. And the same thing happens in Carolina. Here's just another law that's passed that compares Native women to African women and puts them side by side. Images of Native women at the time were often associated with corn and children. In the English mind, fieldwork was degrading. It was something that a wench did. As Kathleen Brown has brilliantly shown, placing Black women in the field was a way of denying them feminine honor. It put them in the masculine category of fieldwork from the English perspective. Settlers did this with Native women too. They understood that there was a relationship to corn and children that existed on some level. And slave codes and the nature of plantation slavery became about breaking these relationships. But these images and writings also varied as Europeans assessed people's potential for sovereignty. Imperial authorities sought out and supported the images of Native queens in search of hierarchies that were similar to themselves. This is an image of an Indian queen in Florida being carried on a litter that circulated in the Atlantic world. Authorities also remarked on Cocoquesky, the leader of the Pamunkeys, as a woman of impressive dignity and power. They made these remarks in the 1670s as they signed her treaty linking her sovereignty to the kings that protected her people from enslavement. They offered her this medal on behalf of the king. And here's her signature here saying Queen of Pamunkey, right? She's also an English queen at the same time that she's a Werenskwa. You can see these layered sovereignties here. When another trader named Thomas Narn traveled among the Chickasaw, who remained important English allies who were recognized by the colonial government, he quote, took particular care to inquire and examine whether anything like patriarchal power was to be found out of a single family. He was disappointed with what he found, which was matrilineality. As he explains, the chief's son never succeeds, nor a woman, though her children do both. Nevertheless, though, his report on the Chickasaw and their civility was more favorable, as opposed to his assessments of the Creek nation, whose allyship to the English was not as steadfast and much more mercurial. He argued that the Chickasaw were more civilized than the Creek because Creek women rule all the family. So all Native people were uncivilized to an extent, but the extent of it mattered as Europeans assessed who they felt had stronger claims to sovereignty, and assessing the role of women became a litmus test for figuring that out. Now, matrilineality was also just one part of an overall system of human and non-human relations that women helped link together, as I discussed at the beginning of the talk. As one Tuscarora woman described it, a matriline is circular, which situates Tuscarora kin within nature, with plants. We think of kin as a circle of the living, everyone together, and indeed, including the plants and animals and other features of nature like the earth itself and the stars. Specifically in the Southeast, and indeed of most of Native North America, corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters or the family, linked the women who produced them together with their community and other non-human relations. Maize was crucial in most Southeastern Native cosmologies to nutrition and to social reproduction. In the Cherokee instance, Selu physically sacrifices her body. This is a cosmological story the Cherokees tell. Her body in order to feed her community. It was a mixture of the earth and the very body of Selu, an adult mother, that gave life to the first corn. Just as in Cherokee daily life, it was the physical labor of mothers and their children that produced maize. Women cared for children while they were in the fields, helping to pass on knowledge and preserve the next generation. As one scholar put it well, plants are the wisdom books of cultures. I love that. Now, long term, the three sisters were a more sustainable crop than monocrops of tobacco or rice that settlers were planting. Corn provides protection from weeds and insects and acts as a scaffold to support bean plants. The beans, in turn, produce nitrogen, essential for plant growth. Adding squash to the mix also controls the growth of weeds and recycling crop residues. A monoculture in which only one crop variety is grown on a plot of land is a relatively recent agricultural technique. A polyculture reduces the risk of an entire harvest being wiped away, so over time it's efficient. So at the same time that enslaved Indigenous women and their kinship lines were being appropriated, settlers began to plant what they called Indian corn. They appropriated this crop probably from Virginia Algonquins. They used it as a food crop in Virginia and South Carolina in order to support monocrop production in the Atlantic economy. They stripped it of its significance that Southeastern Native people associated with it. They adopted it because it was cheap. They preferred wheat, an alien crop to Native women, which had its own cosmological significance in European Christian culture as the crop of the Bible, the body of Christ, and bread. Settlers referred to Indian corn in South Carolina as, quote, coarse and mean fare, and, end quote, as savage trash. In 1714, a man named Richard Walthall bought more land and tobacco to expand his fields of the plant and also his Indian corn. He also drew up a will stating, "I give and bequeath to my daughter, Elizabeth Walthall, my Indian girl named Peg, she and her increase." When English slave owners deployed partisan Native women, this meant that they were forced to pass on racial slavery to children instead of matrilineal kinship ties and political inheritance. But the application of racial slavery to Native peoples within the plantation complex also became a way of dismantling Indigenous sovereignty through attacks on both women and non-human plant relations at the same time. Through this gendered attack, slave owners effectively dismantled Indigenous governance systems that were embodied in each individual woman. From the perspective of Indigenous Southeasterners, Walthall was attacking plants and non-human relations as he was attacking Indigenous women. So when you attack the plants, you attack the women. And when you attack the women, you attack the plants. There's a feedback loop of violence here. This shows that ecological colonialism was key to Indigenous slavery in the South. Now, a primary concern of the field of Indigenous feminist writing has been writing Indigenous women back into the land, to focus on, as Joanne Barker has put it, remapping Indigenous peoples back into their governance systems and territorial rights as culturally knowledgeable subjects, refuting US and Canadian narrations. As we take the lessons related to the violence of the archive of slavery into account from Black feminist scholars, it becomes necessary, I think, to consider enslaved Indigenous women's relationships to land based on traditional Southeastern Native understandings of ecology and body sovereignty. This helps us understand the commodification and archival violence, as well as we approach the sources. Now, I'm inspired again by Black feminist geographers and historians who have considered how to place enslaved Black women back into space. I've been talking about enslaved Native people becoming deterritorialized, but obviously enslaved African people were deterritorialized through the Middle Passage, through the everyday of enslavement. But I think we get to something of a different reality for Indigenous women slaves and their children on these southern plantations, which is that, unlike Black women, enslaved Indigenous women came from nations who were actively attempting to defend their territories and kin from the colonial governments who enslaved them. Virginia and Carolina governments were negotiating this question of Native slavery and sovereignty with Native groups at the same time that Native women were attempting to find their own territory in plantation spaces and exercise acts of fugitivity there. Some of you will be familiar with Stephanie Camp's use of the concept rival geographies in her book, Closer to Freedom. She argues that enslaved Black women developed careful geographic expertise to escape the surveillance of the plantation system and exercise feelings of pleasure by dancing and dressing. This is a rival geography because it's different than the geography of surveillance and control that the planter would see. It's easy to forget, but Camp actually adopted this term from Edward Said, who used it to describe Palestinian resistance to colonial surveillance. I think this is an example of what you have to do when studying people like Sam's mother, or the other women I've talked about today, which is bring the colonialism and the struggle for sovereignty back into the analysis of space. These enslaved women were Indigenous. How did enslaved Indigenous women keep their body sovereignty alive within the plantation complex and support the struggles of the nations they had been disconnected from? These are the kinds of questions I'm asking. So, to conclude, if we turn back to the ad again, when Sam's mother passed on the information to Sam, language, location of kin, knowledge of the textile trade, this was an act of fugitivity. Though her direct political role within her nation had been broken at the moment of enslavement, it lived on under slavery in a fugitive form. Through her knowledge, her child Sam was still able to imagine a way back into sovereign Indigenous territory in the Southeast together with his companion Samson. Keeping knowledge alive ties to human relations, non-human relations going. This is how Indigenous women created fugitive spaces under slavery. Thanks. That's all I have for y'all.
Thank you so much, Hayley. We're going to take questions. We would definitely, we'd prefer if you write questions in the chat, but Norma has her hand up. And so Norma, why don't you just go ahead, and those following can follow up in chat.
Okay, a moment here. Sorry about this. That was an accident. That was supposed to be the clapping sign, because I knew I had myself up. But so I did not have a question. So I just want to thank you. That was great. That was a really amazing, fascinating. Even though I grew up on the East Coast and thought I knew something about Native traditions and, you know, the Northeast and the erasures of those, I had no idea about this. So, but it's such a new thing, I think, for a lot of us. And I also appreciate the way that you tied it really close focus historically and on the archival narratives, et cetera, but also with, you know, the Said reference at the end is quite apt, but it was a nice way of connecting to some of us who work on in other fields as well. So not a question, not intending to say anything at this point, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Norma. That's a great question to start the Q&A.
I wouldn't mind throwing something in here, and we can follow up. There's something coming up in the chat, but I was really, Hayley, thank you so much again for this. I was wondering if you could say just a little bit more about the comparison to Black slaves in the Americas, particularly in relation to the politicization and the issue of sovereignty, because your talk just really made me aware of the stakes of origins that are told in some slave narratives like Equiano's, where that there does seem to be a place that Equiano traces his origin to, but its political efficacy is lost. And I was just, I mean, is there any more to say there about that sovereignty isn't entirely absent for in the story of Black slaves? It seems to be there.
No, it's there.
It has political potential, but yeah, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, definitely. So I think that that's why I see Native slavery as such a contested institution in the South. So the Middle Passage effectively deterritorializes so many enslaved African Americans, and they have to rebuild their political relationships and their lives. And there's a whole, I think, piece of scholarship to be done on, you know, Maroon societies and what kind of sovereignty they're imagining, you know, and all of these, you know, people working on geography are working on how to think through African people's relationships to space and politics and sovereignty. I think that the difference that I'm just trying to highlight here is that the governments, right, that are enslaving Native women are also trying to manage direct sovereign relationships with Native nations at the same time in North America. Virginians love the fact that the issue of deterritorialization and sovereignty for African people is somebody else's problem. It's going on in Africa, right? And it's not to say that Virginian officials or South Carolina officials aren't connected to the English Empire in Africa and what's going on there, but it's just to say that these there are decisions being made on the ground about how to deterritorialize Native people that you do not have to make about African people, right? Because that job has already been done through the Middle Passage. Does that help?
Yeah, it's just such a fascinating issue, and the importance of representation in
Yeah.
the whole endeavor is just really fantastic. We do have a question from Alejandra
Hi, Alejandra.
about method. Can you talk more about your methods?
Yeah. I mean, I guess broadly what I'm trying to do, is bring Indigenous feminisms into the histories of the Native Southeast more directly, right? And I think that opens up space for new archival interpretations. So my aim has always been to do the historical work of sitting in the archive, right, and creating those pie charts. I have looked at so many wills and inventories. But for me, I don't think the project could just be quantitative. I think that the project also needs to talk about these issues of plant relations and how that's related to body sovereignty. So really thinking through the work of Indigenous feminists just really helped me interpret the sources. And I think it also helps make the project legible to contemporary Indigenous people, right? Which should be part of the point for early Americanists working on Native histories. I could say more about methods forever, but I'll just...
We have a question from Kate Schuster about K through 12 education. I'm interested in how you'd assess the status of K through 12 education in this area and what directions we can offer to teachers looking to better stories in earlier education contexts.
Oh, wow. So there are folks at the American Indian Center and Native community members who work directly with CPS who are experts on this. So I am happy to refer you to them because they are the experts and really, are on the ground working with how to integrate Native histories into CPS. So just to preface that, but, I guess I'll give my general point, I guess, that I always give, which is just sort of like, if you're going to talk about Indigenous people in nature, you also have to talk about sovereignty and their contemporary political struggles. And I think young kids can understand that. I think that they can understand that, it's common in K through 12 education for, teachers to say, Native people are in tune with nature. And isn't this sort of like childlike? And I mean, some of that representation happens. And, honestly, I think a lot of teachers are just trying to do their best and are trying to recognize that the relationship to nature is important with Native people. But the massive piece that they're missing is that this is political and then there's a struggle over sovereignty and territory that's happening. So, doing something like contacting, Fawn, who's the educational director at American Indian Center and works in the First Nations Garden, about a class visit to the garden. I mean, I think that would really help K through 12 students put this conversation about nature and Native people into the very real struggles of Native people in Chicago over land and medicine and plants.
I think that we can unmute some people to ask questions as well. I think we can manage to do that. So Claire Dakota has a question. Claire, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, Hayley. This was so great. Thanks for doing this in this very bizarre format. It was a really amazing talk. So my question was about, I really, really appreciated the work that you're doing on connecting processes of racialization to issues of sovereignty and how that does and doesn't work differently for African slaves who've been already deterritorialized versus the ways in which racialization processes actually do a deterritorialization of Native peoples, especially women. So I thought that was really fascinating. And you mentioned really briefly something about the kind of medicalized aspects of discourses about Indigenous peoples, about disease, for example. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how those medicalized forms of discourse kind of fit into this broader argument that you're making about the linkage between race and sovereignty.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I guess that fits into what I'm talking about with how settlers start to kind of argue that natives are unsuitable for slavery. One way they start to think through that is by saying all Native people died or that they have weak bodies. And, you know, this is a contradictory thing in the colonial time period. I mean, Joyce Chaplin does the best work on this. So, you know, if you want to read about it, that's who you go to. But, you know, she writes about race and disease and kind of questions of the Native body in the colonial period, and kind of argues that over time, Native bodies are portrayed as more and more weak. The thing is, though, is that there's no analysis of slavery or race. And, you know, her arguments span, you know, like 1500s to around 1700 in that article, The Racial Idiom. It's a really, really great article. I would just build on it. But anyway, yeah, she doesn't talk about this process of slavery. It's fascinating. You know, these scholars working in the 90s and 2000s, there's never any mentioning of slave codes where natives are everywhere. So I guess what I'm just trying to do is put these questions of racial slavery in more direct conversation with like narratives of disease and weakness, and to kind of see, you know, not everybody's saying that, right? There are plenty of traders who do not talk about the weakness of Native women's bodies. It's really different. It's a varied discourse. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Mark, you're on mute.
Oops. Sarah Johnson, thank you. Sarah Johnson has a question here about a follow-up question about methods. And so if Sarah is willing to unmute and ask that question.
Sarah.
Sure. Hi, Hayley. Thank you so much for this talk. So many things to dig into, but I just really appreciate how you are bringing people like Hartman and Camp into this conversation, especially around sort of geography and how people are moving and moving back. So this example of the boy and the man at the beginning, sort of, as you say, imagining a way back into a sovereign place is just, oh, it's a lot. So I am still thinking with a lot of things, but my question was sort of, you know, kind of coming from a literary studies angle, like when you talk about Hartman and description as one way of trying to reckon with people so minimally represented in the archive, I was just thinking about how she also talks about narrative restraint and the kind of ways we might avoid romance in reimagining people's lives. So I was wondering, in terms of your methods and as a historian, how that shapes and how your materials are shaping the way you write and what kind of limits you find yourself in. But does it sort of at the kind of sentence or style level, do you find yourself having to write differently about this topic than maybe something else?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it just gets so incredibly heavy as you're writing. I was just doing a lecture on Columbus and sexual violence against Native women yesterday, and I usually discuss an actual rape, and I do that because I really think the students have to hear it. They just have to know that this happened. But for whatever reason, yesterday I just couldn't do it. You know, I don't know. I was writing this talk, and so maybe that is an example of restraint. I described things, but I didn't narrate the actual moment of sexual violence. So, you know, there are moments of like that in the work. I just think that, you know, when you're working with Indigenous feminisms and you're considering that work, and you also have, you know, read a bit of Afro-pessimism and, you know, you've worked in that field a little bit. I think you realize how hopeful Indigenous feminisms actually is. I mean, you know, obviously they're narrating incredible acts of violence, but they're also narrating ways back into the land. You know, Indigenous feminist writers are talking about that all the time. And so that is really what inspires me methodologically when I'm looking at these sources of these enslaved Indigenous women, you know, being valued in pounds of tobacco, is, you know, writing them back into the land the way the feminist Indigenous writers would. Because that's what they're trying to do too, right? That's what Indigenous women are trying to get back to historically, right? It makes sense. There's so many incidents where they're either getting away or they're, you know, leaning on the sovereignty of their tribal nation to, you know, escape enslavement. There's just, it makes sense. And also Europeans are appropriating their crops, right? And so in a bizarre way, Native women are, you know, are experts working on plantations, still in the Southeast, you know, in the broad landscape where they were born. So I guess there's hope. I find hope in Indigenous feminism. I hope that's helpful.
No, it is. We will
talk.
We have another question to probe the issue of sovereignty from Chris Boyer.
Oh,
hi, Chris.
Hi.
Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Congratulations, Hayley. I mean, this was a really, I couldn't be more impressed by the power of this presentation and its meaningfulness. I just wanted to sort of follow up on the discussion of sovereignty and sort of to think about that as a, I guess it's a question. Are you thinking of this in some ways as a liminal space in which Native people are, you know, of necessity trying to make sense of what Europeans understand sovereignty to be?
Okay.
And if so, I guess my question is, to what extent did Europeans really try to understand their own sense and that of Native people? I mean, one way that they understood sovereignty was through violence and simple use of power. But, you know, in some colonial situations, there's also, maybe for very strategic reasons on the part of the colonists, an attempt to sort of make some sort of sense of what it is they're seeing. And I'm wondering if you see that dynamic happening as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I was trying to get across in the talk, is just Europeans are trying to make sense of what sovereignty ought to be for Native people. And, you know, they come from a legal order, you know, they come from legal orders where this is a question. They don't just spring out of ships coming across from England. You know, there are international questions about what Indigenous sovereignty is. And everybody, every lawyer in Europe is thinking about this, right? Early Latin Americanists do this all the time, study this all the time, right? But the English are adopting a lot of what the Spanish do, and they're trying to figure it out. They're just not as obvious about it. I was chatting with the Latin Americanist about some of my research, and he was like, oh, Politico, that's what the Spanish do. They decide, you know, the Chichimecos, they have no sovereignty, they're not political. Whereas the Andes, you know, their gender relations are better, their communities are better, they've got it, they've got something more, you know? And I'm like, that's what I've been working on and thinking I've been seeing for years, but haven't been sure of. And the sources are finally confirming it. But if I had just, you know, been a Latin Americanist earlier, I probably would have seen the connections earlier. But the thing is with the English archive is it's less of an imperial bureaucracy, right? And they're writing a lot of this just war stuff down less. But you see it in slave codes. You see Virginians trying to look through, well, are we in amity with this local Native nation? Because if we're in amity with them, then we can't actually enslave their people. So they are thinking about just war. They're wondering, and to me, that implies, and I think in the law of that time, that implies a form of recognition of Native nationhood. And then I guess the piece for me that becomes helpful with women is kind of building off Jennifer Morgan's work, right? Where she shows that these, you know, bodily representations of African and Indigenous women really matter in terms of how the Europeans are understanding what they're seeing in these societies. So a lot of it is putting Herman Bennett together with Jennifer Morgan. I hope that helps.
Hayley, I think maybe we could put a couple of different, we've got quite a few things coming in here, so I'm gonna maybe lump a couple of things together at the risk of shorting a couple of people out. Marianne Lyons, I do need to say that everyone is saying what a great talk this is, and how interesting and exciting the work is. So echoing that once again, taking note of tobacco not just as a commodity, but as a means of exchange, is a really is important given the ecological issue. And perhaps you might want to say more about that. Laura Hostetler, possibly Laura, you'd like to build on this a little bit. She's asking about whether you have used Indigenous cartographies in your work, and what might be out there for you to draw on. So maybe you'd like to, perhaps Laura would like to follow up on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to expand a little bit. One of the things I found so impressive about the talk and what made it work is the way you're putting things back together that were taken apart by those who wanted to enslave these people, take away the connection to the land, take away what made them sovereign, etc. And I know often when we look at colonial maps of North America, Virginia in particular, if we look at the English maps, you know, the native people have largely disappeared, right? So I guess what came to my mind, is there an Indigenous cartography, even if it's not drawn, even if it's more somehow verbal or recorded in another way, that might possibly add another layer to what you're doing? And I don't know, that's not the area of cartography I really work in, but I was just curious about that.
Oh, that's great, Laura. That's so helpful to me. Can I answer this, Mark? Is that okay? Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. So absolutely, there is Indigenous cartography in the Southeast, and there are amazing, there's an amazing Catawba deerskin map that I'm thinking of. Every Southeastern expert sitting on this call has seen it 1,000 times and probably taught with it. Native nations are in circular forms, and they're connected through kind of trails, and, you know, and it maps onto the geographic space of the Southeast. But Alan Taylor has written about this, the circles and the squares in colonial, in the colonial world. Native people represent themselves in a circular way. The English represent themselves in a more square way, which has to do with property and also kinship relations. So I guess suffice to say, I mean, there are Native people traveling throughout the Southeast, right? They're both being forced into slavery and they're both fleeing slavery. And they're doing it through geographic knowledge. So I don't really know what else to say besides I think I should be using these maps a lot in my work from now on, because I think it helps explain, it adds another layer, like you're saying. So yeah, I don't have anything more to say except.
Okay, yeah. There are folks at the Smith Center at the Newberry who could probably,
yeah,
you know, show you what's available locally too. But
but as I talk about geography, it's really important, right?
And yeah, and you started down that direction, and that's why I kind of pick up on it. So, you know, kudos to you. But yeah.
Thank you.
Kevin has a question about Indigenous feminisms and resistance. And Kevin, do you want to follow up on that?
Sure. Great job, Hayley, and I'm so glad you're representing the Department of History. Yay, team. So one of the things that I really love about your work is that you basically are introducing all these different forms of resistance. You know, weapons of the weak or whatever language we want to use. You're sort of showing how knowledge of the land or different ways of understanding matrilineal patterns could be used, deployed to protect sovereignty, despite the fact that the British or the English are coming ramrod over and forcing people into slavery. So I love that. But my question is to ask you to pull the lens way back and sort of say the introduction of this sort of Indigenous feminism, which I think is a fantastic development in your work. How does that play into the macro story of sort of the rise of racialized African slavery throughout the 1700s and the decline, just purely numerically, of native slavery in after 1690, say?
Okay. So, I mean, I guess the argument I'm trying to make, right, is that Native nations eventually stopped being involved in the slave trade because they were trying to protect Native women and matrilineal kinship relationships. And I wouldn't have seen those relationships as clearly as I have in the sources if I hadn't been reading Indigenous feminists. Leanne Simpson talks about matrilineality as a political order that particularly disturbs settler colonial states. And, you know, that's historical. You see that in the sources, as I talked about with traders. They are specifically saying matrilineality as a political order is disturbing. And then they are enacting, you know, breaking that apart through partis on plantations and slavery. But the overall, I guess, point of the story, I guess, I feel like you're kind of asking about like the ending of the story, like when I end in 1717, right? Like, you know, why does Native slavery taper off a little bit? And it does keep going throughout the 18th century, but like the big wave of the trade stops in there. And I think, you know, it's about Indigenous nations trying to protect women and children and matrilineal gender relations. That's why they stopped the trade. I don't know if there are Southeastern experts on here that want to talk to me about that more, but you know, that's how I see it. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? That's a great question.
We have two really fascinating questions here. And I think if people are willing to, and if you, Hayley, are willing to stick on for a couple more questions, that would be really great. They're both really fantastic ones. One from Gabrielle Powell. Gabrielle, can you go first and ask and follow up on this?
Hi, great. Hayley, this has just been wonderful work. So I really appreciate you
So much.
and all the years that you've been spending in the archives. I know it's really grueling work. I've been in communication with a lot of baby boomers and people who are involved in food sovereignty in the African American community in Chicago. And a lot of them will tell me that they grew up speaking Chickasaw and that they had uncles that only spoke Indigenous languages. So one of the questions that I had put in the chat is that I'm seeing some people looking at getting sovereign recognition of their tribal status as a different means of counteracting Jim Crow persecution in the South, and as younger generations are wanting to go back to the land and look at, you know, more organic or other sustainable practices, looking at both their African and Indigenous crops and reviving those on the land, they are getting recognition. And having that ability to have that federal relationship with the United States government as a way to supersede the other local and state issues of policing and you know, lack of prosecution of crimes. And so that's an interesting thing that I'm seeing. And otherwise, just people moving back to the land and practicing Indigenous, you know, indigeneity and foodways, and just, you know, disregarding whether they have specific bloodlines that they can track, or and just saying, look, we have this as our history, and I'm not, even though it's been, the documentation is not there, or it's so grueling to be able to get it from the archives for any of these things, they're irregardless just going back and buying land en masse, like lots of young people, right? So it's interesting. I'm curious about these ideas, and actually, as a counterpoint, you know, they were recognized as phenotypically Black. It was genocidal. So that's the positionality of saying that these people were not Indigenous because they didn't look Indigenous.
Yeah.
And we have issues where northern states were taking the children in the 50s and 60s and 70s and putting them in Black foster homes in Chicago and utilizing them as a Pied Piper genocidal strategy in our northern cities, where I have family members who don't look Indigenous, except people who are Indigenous look at them and say, I know you're tribal. But they are enrolled tribal members, but they are invisible, right, phenotypically. So
Right.
we have a couple of different threads of northern tribes that are invisible, but also southers. And we have them in Chicago, which is amazing, right? So any conversation on that would just be really exciting to hear. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure what to say. I mean, it's just an amazing recollection or just discussion of so many things that are going on right now. I just would refer you, I guess, first to Jenny Davis's work at Urbana. She does language reclamation work. She's Chickasaw, and she's an amazing scholar. And I mean, all of that scholarship on language is about how if you recover your language, you recover your sovereignty, right? And I guess the language piece is really key. I mean, other experts can speak on this so much better than I can, but when you learn an Indigenous language, you kind of see the world through Indigenous eyes in a way that you never could before. I think that that's very, very key. And I think that as historians, we need to be learning more Native languages, or even just working as much as we can with the vocabulary lists we have from the 1600s and what the missionaries wrote. So I guess I'll just, food sovereignty, language sovereignty, these issues absolutely overlap. And I guess, the story I'm telling is a lot about early deterritorialization, right? And, racialization as a form of deterritorialization through slavery. And I guess, that continues throughout history. That's a process that, Afro-Indigenous people have to deal with. And I mean, the Pamunkey Nation that I work with a little bit, one of the tribal council members, she's a baby boomer, and she was talking about her grandmother. Everybody in her grandmother's age group would have been known as colored, or black, right? Because, that was the phase when Virginia was deciding that they didn't, have sovereign Native nations on their land, right? They had, quote, colored people or racialized people. So I guess the struggle to, return and to be known, and have connections to nation is just a constant one throughout American history. And, you see it even in WPA narratives in the 1800s. Enslaved or formerly enslaved African people are talking about Indigenous ancestors because it's a way of, even in their minds, going back to their territory or finding a form of freedom because it's linked to sovereignty, right? They want a different vision of America that isn't the America that has enslaved them. They want a different state. They want a different kind of sovereignty to return to. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I'm so happy to talk with you about this at any time more.
Layla Blackbird has a related question here about the role that mixed race children of enslaved Black and Native people might have in your book project, and if Layla is here to follow up on this.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot going on with the children of Native women in this moment, right? One thing that I think my work does is kind of help us really see like the diverse racial categorization that actually was going on in the American South in this period, right? Mestizos were a thing. That was a thing, right? And it's based off of the Spanish mestizo idea. This is an Afro-Native child, right? And what happens with a lot of Native women, right? Some of them end up enslaved in plantations with another Indigenous person who may or may not be a kin relation, but a lot of Native women end up on plantations with no Native men present. So what we see is a struggle to kind of reconstitute matrilineal kinship relationships with children in an Afro-Native context. What does that look like under slavery? And sometimes what you see is those children, like with Sam, attempting to find their way back, right? So again, I'm just focusing on, women who pass down knowledge to their children and, try to help them return to an idea of freedom. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'll just...
I think we're a little bit past 5:30. I think it's time to thank Hayley very warmly again for such a wonderful talk and such a great way of starting out the year. So kudos to you, Hayley. Thank you so much.